This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of personal care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax/bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking about decision making where it matters the most with Kodey Bogart. So Kodey is a seasoned Black Hawk pilot who's pivoted into the civilian world and indeed has flown medical missions both in the military and elsewhere. And today what we're really going to do is dissect Kodey's fantastic aviation career, but also her decision-making under pressure. So Kodey is a pilot whose career has really spanned the sharp end of combat aviation through to complex, safety-critical world of civilian HEMS operations as well. So Dr. Kodey is a former US Army Warrant officer and aviator who flew Black Hawks during medical evacuation missions in the military. But she's also a decorated combat veteran, having received 2 air medals and a Sikorsky Rescue Award. So Kodey has also made history as the first female to be designated as a pilot in command for day and night vision goggle operations in combat for Florida National Army Guard. Kodey, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Owen, for having me. I appreciate it. I'm really excited.
It's great to have you on, actually, and just really do a deep dive really into your background and just look at how, you've made decisions in the past and just actually garner some of the pearls of wisdom, actually, Kodey. And I guess that's a nice segue into, I guess, the first question, which is really, from that high risk environment that you used to fly combat medevac missions, could I get you to really speak to how that translated to really into civilian HEMS work and indeed maybe what you pulled through from your military experience?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There is some obvious differences, even though it's the same mission. We're going out to save a life or lives, plural. But really, to me, transfer as well. And you might hear me say this a couple times during our podcast because it's really a good ethos for me. And that is relationships or communication in general can make or break any relationship. I don't care if it's with a child, a spouse, a coworker, or a crew. So that leads me into what transfers well. And something I'm very much happy that I learned when I was in the military was crew coordination under pressure, right? Really being able to voice whatever you need, and it might be something negative, but you have to voice it. Or even if you're flying with someone and they just seem different today than they are normally, just looking at them and saying, "Hey, are you okay? Is everything all right today? You just seem a little different." Um, those open lines of communication, but specifically in the aircraft when on the mission, we talk what's important. There's no unnecessary chatter, especially when on the mission. If you're out flying, to or from, the patient, there might be some, different communication, but being really specific on what's important to talk about. Time on target, getting there safely. Am I clear? Ready for takeoff, on comms, off comms, all of those things, are really important, that standardized communication and brevity.
Just that explicit communication, as you were saying, Kodey. Yeah, I think it's excellent because in a way, if a person is, they've got things in their social life or things in their personal life, but actually you still need an explicit line of communication. You still need to communicate, and I say explicitly, just clarity of communication, intensive communication, and just make sure it's or whatever's happening in the background, you're still showing up and you're still present and indeed coherent to your colleague.
Yeah, I always think in my head about this. If I'm driving in a vehicle with someone and we're coming up to a left-hand turn, you don't say, "All right, turn right here," even though it's left. Hey, we're t turning left here. Not like so. It's that clarity of communication to make sure what's understood is understood. I do this with my children a lot, and especially my daughter. She just started driving. Very simple terms. If I need her to stop doing something, I'm like, "Hey, maybe when we get up here, let's look at, no, it's stop." That's it. Just that brevity and that clarity in what you're saying. And I've had that flying into really tight landing zones before where wires are around. And my TFO, my task force observer, who was also my medic, and we wouldn't be like, "Oh, I think I see some wires out there." It was very clear, stop. And then once I stop, then we talk about like what's going on, what is he seeing, things like that. So it really, really super important on that part. Um, and then that kind of leads me into what also transfers well, and that's, mission first discipline with clear roles. I am this is what you're doing. I need you on radios on these two frequencies, or um, you're the one talking to the medic on the ground about patient info and what's going on there. I'm doing this. I'm speaking to, whether it's a tower or a local sheriff's office or whatever it might be, but clear roles of who's doing what in the aircraft is super important. Um, in the civilian world, this is so funny to me, but I would actually get out of the aircraft with the blades turning. So I'd friction the controls, be down at idle. I would have to get out of the aircraft and I would move the litter out for the patient to be loaded. And I didn't weigh enough to fly solo up front, so I had to put 50 pounds of extra weight and strap it into the front seat next to me. So clear roles like, hey, what type of patient do we have? Am I putting the litter full out, or is it a smaller patient, maybe a child, where I don't have to do all that and they can easily just get in through the door? So clear roles and what's happening. Um, and then some other stuff I think we've briefly touched on was, having that dynamic risk assessment. It's not like I did a risk assessment, I'm done. It's a living document through the mission. Those are, I think, the main lessons that translate really well from military to civilian.
So talk about risk, Cody, if you would, a bit more, and just maybe if you could just unpack just your tolerance of risk, the risk thresholds that you were prepared to take, both in the military, because there is a different term of reference within civilian HEMS, but similarly, it's good to have, to your point, an appreciation of risk, and actually, just slow the approach, understand the risks of a civilian mission, which are very real,
Mhm.
albeit maybe less, but still real. Maybe there is more dynamic risk involved in combat missions, medevac missions. Just talk a little, if you could just talk a little bit more about risk and about holding risk.
Yeah, so that acceptance mindset is truly important. In combat, mission completion may outweigh the risk. We do threat briefs, for example, before going out to fly, and I know that we're going to take fire when I go in for this patient. If it was a civilian world, I wouldn't go, right? Um, in the civilian HEMS world, no patient outcome justifies crew loss. And I'm not saying in the military crew loss is also justified, but we're willing to take a higher risk knowing the threats and uh, terrain around in order to, I'm in the United States, in order to pick up a US soldier or a NATO ally. I'm going to go, even though I'm going to, probably, like I said, take small arms fire or whatever. In addition, when I was overseas in Iraq, um, at the time, we were the only medical company in theater who would fly single ship. Other maintenance, medevac units had to have an Apache gunship support, but the Apaches couldn't always fly either. So we would go single ship regardless, in order to, to do our mission and to save those at the surface. Combat teaches you how to operate in chaos. Where civilian hem teaches you when to say no. And yes, you can say no in the military. It's just a little different.
To your point around just appreciating the dynamic nature of the job and the changing risk profile in the moment and almost doing maybe Oh, well, moment by moment OODA loops. So, orientating yourself to a new risk, which and it's vocalizing that risk to your point, and then doing an OODA loop. So, observe, orientate, decide, and act.
Hmm.
When the dynamic risk does come to you. But so you are an advocate for SMS, which is, it's a safety management systems, and they are widely adopted and quite rightly so. But could I get you to speak to them, just maybe unpack for listeners what they are and what they serve to do?
Yeah, so just a high level introduction to safety management systems or SMS. There are four major components and associated elements that go under each of those. But basically, it starts off with saving, having a safety policy, which is really management's commitment to say we are going to do everything we can to support a safe environment, a safe culture. We're going to give you the tools and resources you need to be successful and safe in your role, right? So that safety policy, it's usually just a one-page document. It's just I always think of it as a military term, as a show of force, if you will. Like, hey, we're putting paper to pen here. We are doing this. The second component is safety risk management, and this is really where the I refer to as the meat and potatoes of a safety system. This is frontline employees reporting what they see to management, management evaluating it, making some sort of mitigations, imparting those mitigations, evaluating if they are effective or not, and then reevaluate or close the item out and see what's around the corner with that and trending on data to make sure we're proactive and not reactive. The third component is safety assurance, and that's basically it's your checks and balances. Are we doing what we say we're doing? Plain and simple on that one. And then safety promotion is your training and communication, making sure people understand what the SMS is, make sure they have the competencies and qualifications for their function in the SMS. And the safety promotion piece also, communicating that through the organization, talking about events. And again, communication makes or breaks the relationship. If I'm going to report something into the system, I kind of want to know what happens to it. I want to know what maintenance or the management's decision was. So give me that feedback loop, right? That communication. So part of your question was, where does SMS fail? I don't know the mindset. I mean, I know the mindset of people, but really falling into a paper compliance versus operational reality. So many organizations, especially as mandates start to come out, specifically here in the US. I know YASA and like Transport Canada and all these other CAs have been more ahead of SMS than we have in the US. But as we start to come on board here, not just making a manual and a binder and putting it on the shelf, right? I'm not looking for just an audit checklist like, oh yeah, we do this, but we need to actually live and breathe it. A safety management system is a living organism, a living document, or whatever. So that operational reality. And some people, especially if they want to buy a manual off the shelf, that's not real to your organization. How do you do things? And the fact is, most companies who don't have like a documented, if you will, SMS are already doing probably 70% of what's needed for a documented safety management system. So it's not a big leap from we have nothing documented to what we want. You're more than halfway there in most companies. Um, Other failures I see is that really frontline input. So, for example, when I go into an organization, I help them to develop and implement their SMS. I speak with management, we work on a safety policy, and we start to lay the groundwork for things down the road. But I love to get in front of the employees because we're human in nature and we don't like change, right? So if I can get in front of them and teach them or educate them about a safety management system, like what is it? It's really not scary. It's not the monkey on your back. It's not Big Brother watching you. Um, and then I want people to know what their role is in that. And, do you understand the difference between a hazard and a risk? And do you know why this is important? And frankly, the company is doing it for your safety, where quality assurance is product safety. Are we producing the quality of the product that we're putting out to our customers, where SMS is employee focused, to make their work um, better, having the right tools and equipment and knowledge to do their job safely. And the last thing I think where SMS might fail is just failure to act on the data that your management's getting, right? Especially near misses. And not everything's a big fire you have to put out, but look at the data that you're getting in your system. You know, that's super, super important, right? SMS fails when they become retrospective and not predictive.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Cody. I couldn't agree more actually. And some of the most powerful teaching, I think, is actually looking at case studies, looking at, tr almost sometimes tragic events, tragic case studies where, to your
Hmm.
point, the safety management, so something's not been explicitly mentioned, or there's been a deviation to sort of normal practice, either in aviation or medicine, but almost these critical incident case studies are great ways to bring the seeds of these teachings to life and put a framework around it for people to visualize. And I think
Hmm.
that visualization helps it jump off the page. Um, and to your point around changing behavior, because like you said, if it remains academic, then there is no behavior change, and then
Hmm.
actually there's just an endurance of poor safety behavior. But if we can, but behavior change, it's cultural. So I think there has to be almost this cultural modeling from the top of the institution to the bottom. But to your
Agreed.
point as well about looking at near misses, dissecting them. When I used to work for London's Air Ambulance, we wouldn't, if you were more than five, or I think it was five or six, SMSs down. If you hadn't read that week's team brief with the SMSs in, the near misses or indeed a critical incident, you couldn't go out and practice. So it
Hmm.
was it was an it was it was an operational imperative to make sure you'd signed your name against all the and it would be risk stratified, so there'd be a risk of reoccurrence and indeed a risk of outcome to the patient or to the team, but you couldn't be operational unless you'd signed that you'd read all the SMSs in the file. Now, I think this is about bringing it to your point, bringing it to life and making sure that there is behavior change.
Yeah, absolutely. So to your point, I think making safety actually work, it sounds simple, but turning reporting, when employees report to the organization, turning that into visible action. No one's going to report if they don't hear about it, if they're not closing the loop. Like you said this and they want to know, what did you do? What did we do to this? And it might come back like, hey, we took your input in our, research of this. We didn't find anything, so there's no action right now. But this is a starting point for us to further gather data if whatever you reported about happens, more than once, right? It could be sometimes things can just be one-offs, but closing that loop with employees so they don't feel like they're doing something that's not taking any action. Why am I going to report if I'm not told about what's happening with it, if I don't see action from those things? And then, embed safety in everything that you do. I know, like, when I walk into a room and I go give some sort of presentation or brief, I know where the AEDs are. I know where the fire extinguishers are. I know if we're going to do a test of the alarm system that day, so I can say, hey, this is where the AEDs are. This is where the fire extinguisher is, should we need. Today in our facility, we're not having any tests of our fire alarm system. So if you hear it, it's actual. This is where we're going to meet outside. And starting off the day with that safety mindset, right? And then taking that further into your pre-flight briefs. Do you have, if you need to wear helmets, I used to work for Bristow. Anytime you were 2 feet off the ground, you had a helmet on, right, for your pre-flight. And we all made fun of it at first, but the fact is, data backed that up. There were more fatalities or catastrophic events that happened to people because they fell from over 2 feet. So just put a helmet on. It's absolutely fine. Safety glasses, safety gloves, make sure it's part of everything we do. And to that end, that pre-flight brief, but when you go on your flight, I know things don't always go as planned. They most never go as planned. So come back and talk about that. Hey, I experienced this. Did you see that too, or was that just me? And talk about that. And those daily conversations, are important. Safety changes behavior when people see it working, not when they see it written on a document or in a binder somewhere.
So let's just talk about decision making under pressure, Cody, if that's okay, and maybe if you could just walk us through a time really in your practice, either military or otherwise, where your situational awareness either degraded or was tested, and indeed how you recognized it and recovered from it. Because true to say, you do and did work in a very much an operationally dynamic environment.
Yeah, so I love this question, and I really had to think about it because we don't often think of our own lack of situational awareness. We're so easy to point it out about somebody else, though. Um, I just kind of laughed to myself when I wrote down my response to this question. But I remember flying in Iraq one time, and it was kind of like a routine patient transfer. And we were going from, I'm going to say, Baghdad area to southern Iraq to drop the patient off. It was late at night, under night vision goggles, long days, long shifts, definitely fatigued, I'm sure to some level. But, well, the desert terrain is very, blanketed and boring and nothing's out there. And it's very common to miss the horizon or mix the two. So I was flying along. I was the pilot on the controls. I was not the pilot in command of this flight. Usually our PICs were the ones who sat left seat and they would operate the radios and all that stuff. So I'm flying along on the controls and I see a light out in the distance and I'm gonna kind of fly towards that light. It's far off, gives me a good frame of reference. And my PIC, he looks at me, he's like, Kodey, how low to the surface are you gonna get? And I was like, what? And I looked at my attitude indicator and my altitude and my VSI, and I was like, holy moly, I was only a few hundred feet off the deck because what I experienced, was that confusion with ground lights. What I started to do was think that that light was a star and, you know, start to descend to be below it because I had confusion, with that dark featureless terrain. So it really made me laugh. I was like, oh my goodness, I could have had a CFIT situation had I not recognized it, um, or had he not recognized it. So I think, that's definitely one time. And I'm sure there's, like I said, a multitude of reasons. Under night vision goggles, tired, blank terrain, things like that. Um, there are a few other times I'm sure, flying in the sheriff's office, the last year I was at the sheriff's office, I was not a full-time employee. I flew about 4 times a month. I would pick up shifts from other people, but I was working on my safety business and that was my full-time job. And so I was there to help augment if someone was sick or if someone wanted to take leave, they would call me in and I would go fly. What I started to notice that though is because I wasn't doing it every day was that I just felt more and more behind the aircraft. Usually radio calls and you can think 5 radio calls ahead. And I just wasn't where I knew I could be. Like I wasn't doing it enough. That rote memorization was starting to diminish a bit. And that's when I was like, you know what? I've enjoyed flying with you guys. I'm going to focus on my company and I don't want to have an issue. So I think that's something where I also noticed my situational awareness was starting to degrade a bit. And my action then was, for me at that time was just to stop flying, sadly, at the time. But it was the right decision. It was the safest decision.
Yeah, indeed. No, indeed, indeed. And to be fair, you're the one that articulated that, it wasn't maybe an extent, not that it would have been a problem if it was an external partner, but the best and indeed the probably the most honest safety messages and indeed safety actions you can take are the ones that you recognize.
hmm
And we have a saying within pre-hospital care, which, the standard you walk past is the standard you're willing to accept. And, it's you in the unseen places
hmm
that can check yourself. And because that's the standard you're willing to accept, both in the light and in the darkness when no one else is watching. So it is about having that good self-talk but also just being honest with yourself, as you were saying,
hmm
Cody. Absolutely. Could I get you to speak to something which you and I have interfaced with and continue to do so, but very much within our clinical practice is cognitive biases, and they can they serve us well. They're there for a reason. These almost these heuristics, but they can be dangerous at times. And maybe could I get you to speak to and maybe unpack for us just some of the more dangerous cognitive biases that you've seen affect HEMS pilots in the past?
Yeah, I think one of the strongest ones I can see is that plan continuation bias. Pressing on, continuing when you should not continue or not pausing when you should. You're nodding a lot. So I think you completely agree and experience that as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I totally agree. I totally agree.
and you can look at numerous accidents, sadly, and that resulted in fatalities where people pressed on through, inclement weather, where they kept, scud running and getting lower and lower or not committing to IFR, all sorts of things where if they'd have just paused or stopped, or never even left, never even taken off, right? So that planned continuation bias. Um, I think for me, coming out from the military, that authoritative gradient, right? So where junior crew doesn't speak up, or in a civilian world, if I've been a pilot in the company and I have a new medic or a new, nurse or TFO, them not speaking up because they're new, they're like, "Oh, you've been here so long, you should know." It's an expectation of what um, and I think people just not speaking up. It's okay to speak up and then like, oh, you know what? Hey, I appreciate you saying that, but here's why I'm doing this. So they can learn and understand. So that, authority gradients. Another thing is that confirmation bias. If I go into a situation with an expectation, I'm going to look for that to prove myself correct. It's a very big thing in accident investigation. If I go into an accident and I say, "Oh, I know what the pilot did, XYZ," I'm going to as I investigate, I'm going to try to prove my theory unintentionally, right? So it's really good to not have that confirmation bias going in. Even when it comes to a scene, I've landed at that scene 10 times before. I know what it's like. Well, yesterday they put up new wires. So don't go in with that bias of what you expect. Just try to think of everything with a new lens. Um, I think that's a really good other one. Uh, I kind of highlighted it maybe earlier in our talk, but just that external pressure of getting there, especially in the civilian world and maybe not in HEMS, but even, private travel, private charter, things like that, is that external pressure to get there. The boss says we need to go. So I have to go even though I know I shouldn't. I think in the HEMS world, we've done really well to get away from that external pressure. A lot of companies are very good at that. I remember coming from the military to the civilian world flying air ambulance. And I remember the first, I don't know, 3 to 5 times I turned down a med flight. I printed every piece of weather. I printed every reason why I made the decision not to go because I was afraid that they would come back and say, "Hey, you should have gone. Why didn't you?" And I wanted to have documentation proof of like why I didn't. The great part about that is I threw that stuff away because I never needed it. Never was I questioned on making the decision to say no. So that external pressure to get there, I think, can hurt some people.
Yeah, listen, I totally agree. And to your point about a sunk cost fallacy, where like you said, you might have even got halfway through a mission, but dynamic weather has changed. And
Hmm.
actually, like you said, just having a healthy baseline for what is appropriate and reasonable versus what is not. And actually, no shame in deviating or indeed canceling the mission and turning back if the weather because it becomes too unsafe or conditions become too unsafe and just yeah like you said just being able to speak up and that kind of leads me nicely into the next question actually Cody, which is really how we change a culture where crew members, both in the cabin and the cockpit, feel psychologically safe to abort a mission, or not even to abort a mission, but just to speak up. I think to a really point about giving people permission to speak into your practice. A pre-brief, say, look, guys, if as in the landing phase, if you see anything out the window, feel free to speak up. If you see any wires or if you see anything which I might miss, just almost giving people permission to speak into your practice levels that hierarchy, as you were saying, and almost that permission to utilize other people's eyes and attention to inform
Hmm.
yours. But could I get you to speak to that?
Yeah, so I love this question as well. You touched at a lot of really good points. I remember so flying at the sheriff's office, we were law enforcement, but we also had a Part 135 air ambulance mission. So air ambulance would always take precedent over law calls. So if I was out patrolling or doing some sort of law enforcement call and a med call came in, again, it would take priority. But my TFO, is also a medic, and they're not, I don't want to say he's not aviation, but he wasn't brought up through training on aviation. He was taught law enforcement and he was taught medical rescue. which is, that's his role, understandably. But I know when we would fly out and do patrols or, just coming back from a med flight back to the airport, I would teach him airport patterns. So upwind, downwind, all that stuff. And I would talk to him about clock positions. And, I would fly in and I know I would see an aircraft. I would hear them on the radio. I would understand where they're at. But I would ask him, hey, where do you think they're at? Can you tell me? And the same thing goes, if I were to experience spatial disorientation, I want them to recognize it in me to help me with that. And so, hey, this is my attitude indicator. Are my wings level? You tell me if they're not, and they should be. Look at my altitude. Check me sometimes and feel free to speak up. But I think educating them is really good. Um, but more to your point, leaders must reward decisions publicly, I think, when people abort. It shouldn't point a finger like, why didn't you? It should be like, hey, I don't know, Kodey had a flight the other day and she chose not to go. And we're really proud of that decision because here's what could have happened, or here's how the weather degraded further. So we're glad she made that decision and the patient made it to the hospital just fine via ground ambulance. So rewarding those good decisions publicly. Avoid second guessing, save calls. Like, oh, I should have went because the weather was fine. But you know what? I made the decision at the time and place and point that was right, that was accurate. Me or my crew, right? Anyone can speak up in that. Um, Understanding that no mission is mandatory. Right. In usual cases, yes, we talk about the golden hour, the getting there to that patient as soon as you can. But most cases, there are ground ambulance. There are people who are trained to treat them en route from point A to point B. So no mission is mandatory. It's extremely helpful, but there's people at the surface who know how to do their jobs effectively, right? And culture definitely is proven when someone says no under pressure.
Cody, could you speak to just the concept and indeed the reality, really, of a high reliability HEMS organization and what it looks like in practice? We speak a lot about doing the basics well, and the basics really are more the essentials than the basics. But to your point about there's a pre-brief before every flight. The SMS file is updated. Actually, you have to sign that you've read the SMS file. That training, high fidelity training, should occur both medically but also aviation wise. And actually, you should train as a team. And then if there's going to be any longitudinal audits or any cold debrief, it should include everyone in that chain. It should include the pilots, should include the clinicians, and it's because you're a team on the mission, so you should be a team in the audit. But could I get you to speak to what the anatomy of a highly reliable HEMS organization looks like from your thoughts?
I always joke about the definition of professionalism because I might say it one way, you might say it one way, and someone else might say it another way. But really, what is a true professional? And that's, constant brief, execute, debrief cycles, doing what you're supposed to do. I might pre-flight the same aircraft for 10 years, but I still use my checklist. I still go in the same order. If I don't have my checklist on hand because I'm climbing on something, when I get down, I go down it. Did I check this XYZ? Because I'm human. We error. So, doing the things that you're supposed to do, that constant brief, execute, debrief. Then even when the mission's fine and I come back, no issues, no harm, no foul, let's talk about it. Because my perception might have been different than someone else's on the crew. So flat communication in the aircraft, that helps with high reliability. Standard call outs, standardized decision triggers. If the weather gets like this, we are done regardless. I don't care. We're going back. Those things are super important. And then leaders who are visible and accountable help in HEMS. There's pockets of aircraft around and they're little silos who are doing their own thing, but it's really important for leadership to get out in front of them and say, hey, what do you need? How can I support you? Just to be visible, right? High reliability isn't always about perfection. It's just about catching those errors early so there's no, outcome or situation down the road.
Yeah, I really like that because in essence you're saying that consistency is key and it is key. And to your point about delegating to a checklist, so you're not reliant on short-term memory. You're doing things methodically and consistently over time,
Mhm.
with a checklist.
With
Um,
intention.
with
Yeah.
intention, absolutely, absolutely. Could I get to speak to because you'll have seen this in practice, Cody, and as have I. But it'd be really interesting to get your received wisdom and reflection on this around, the balance between clinical urgency. So, you might have a critical care patient in the back. It might be a critical care soldier which has got multiple gunshot wounds or otherwise. But that aviation safety and the priorities, to your point, some of the dynamic changes that occur from an aviation perspective, you've already onboarded a critical care patient. Um, but could I get you to speak to, yeah, just some of your practice and what you advocate for really, keeping that baseline of safety, that cockpit crew interaction, so that the good CRM. Could I get you to speak to that?
Yeah, so it's a good point as well. You know, again, that communication makes or breaks things, but often understanding, and the crew should understand together, time pressure versus safety margins. I understand they're trying to save a life in the back, but if I don't do it safely, and whatever that might look like, if I need to route around something that's going to take us a little bit longer, or whatever that looks like, we're not helping anyone if we have an accident and all of us perish, and we destroy this aircraft or whatever that, whatever that is. So understanding time pressure versus safety margins. Um, there are different definitions of urgency. So having clear, concepts of what that looks like. And then any communication gaps. I might, make a decision as a pilot flying in a certain direction or whatever, but I don't know, I might not know the urgency of what's happening in the back or what they're experiencing with the patient. So them just saying, hey, if we could ask for this from the control tower, I'm experiencing this with my patient right now. And I remember when I was a young air ambulance person in the civilian world, understanding the terminology, what they're saying in the back is important. This medical issue versus this medical issue, what's more important? I might route around some other traffic or ask, can I go direct to based on what's happening with the patient in the back? So understanding that, and then any, communication gaps, just being able to speak up, whatever that might be. And I feel bad oftentimes for the, the clinicians in the back because it's still important for them to look outside the aircraft and see and avoid traffic and to help with that piece because safety is the most important part of that time in the aircraft. And they're so busy doing things, right? But I think the key truth when it comes to this is we need to understand that everyone is trying to save the patient, whether you're physically hands-on with that patient or you're flying the aircraft to get the patient to medical attention. We're just looking at things from different angles, right? And to know that we're all trying to do the same thing. Let's just communicate about it so we can get there safely together.
No, listen, I really I like that, but also I agree with that. I think to your point about not using institutional language, which might be siloed to aviation or indeed clinical. So three letter acronyms or otherwise that actually might preclude understanding. So just clear English or just clear logical communication, which, like you say, infers maybe the clinical presentation and indeed the trending, but also that to your point around good CRM, crew resource management, Cody, is around that not altering your level of risk perception. So you're not going to then, as a pilot, take untethered or unregulated risk
Hmm.
according to the patient presentation, because actually you still need a healthy baseline of what's acceptable, even if you do have a critical care patient in the back. And actually, we used to call it the red mist. Certainly within when you be driving a critical care asset or an ambulance, if and early on in the career, I certainly got this a few times where you take unfathomed risk in traffic because you knew the nature of what was happening in the back. And that actually altered the risk profile
Hmm.
to an unhealthy level, actually. And it was actually only through debrief, to your point, that some of my colleagues said, "Oh, look, you have to slow down when you're driving." And some of your driving techniques, although it was a critical care patient, although he was super sick, you've got to slow down because we couldn't do anything in the back because we were just being
Hmm.
thrown around from left to right. And actually, it was good. It was good feedback for me because so I could just be far more methodical in my
Hmm.
approach rather than sporadic in just because of the case presentation.
Yeah, we get in that chaos, right? We need to stay calm and methodical to your verbiage.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, Cody, just looking at near misses and or reviewing incidents, could I get you to speak to because you are in a consultant role now, and you consult amongst many different HEMS services and aviation services. Could I get you to speak to any patterns you repeatedly see, and any any efforts that you see HEMS operations and or services making to close loops on near misses from your experience?
Yeah, so a lot of patterns I see, I think the most predominant piece is repeated normalization of deviance. It's where something is not to be done a certain way, but it has been, and it's been that way for so long, no one even notices it anymore. And I'm going to go back just to the pre-flight checklists. I was once at an organization where I was the only one who used a pre-flight and a startup checklist. Everyone else had been there for 200 years and they knew it and they did know it. They weren't wrong about that, but they were wrong about not just going back. They were kind of failing to see that they are human and they can err and miss things. So they had been not using those checklists for so long. It was normalized by other crew members, by maintenance technicians, and by management because it was accepted. And the moment you accept something like that, you've set a new standard. The new standard is now I don't need it because my management or my peers aren't saying anything. The same thing goes in the maintenance realm. If you walk onto a shop floor and you're supposed to wear safety goggles and you see someone working on an aircraft and they don't have those goggles on, say something. They might have just forgotten them. But if you walk past that as a peer or a leader, especially, you've now set that as the new standard. Hey, they didn't say anything to me. I must not need them. And I think most of us in aviation are a little anti-authority as it is. So, if I don't have to wear them, I'm not going to wear them. No one said anything. So that normalization of deviance. At the beginning of our talk, I mentioned, communications make or break any relationship. So just communication breakdowns. We're human, we speak different languages, and I don't mean like our dialect. I mean, we just say things different in a different inflection, in a different tone. I might be emotional about something that has nothing to do with what we're doing. It could be something that happened at home. Just those communication breakdowns and realizing, again, we're all there to save the life of the patient. And, especially in HEMS, I think people who fly air ambulance, are really selfless people. We really want to do good by our community. And to know that, and to know that the person's intent is not to be negative or whatever it might be, just have those conversations. Don't be afraid to talk, right? And talk with someone, not down to someone. Um, Other patterns I see are incomplete risk assessments or after the fact risk assessments. I've seen this in one organization. You get a medical call in. It's a high risk patient. We need to go now. I'll do the risk assessment when I get back because I know I'm fine. It becomes a paper exercise versus then some sort of safety mitigation effort from the onset. And I know like, oh, I have plenty of sleep. I'm still good on my crew time. The aircraft's fine. I know I flew it, an hour ago and I know it. So why do I need to do another risk assessment? And I think, those are in place to help us catch the things that we miss because again, we're fallible, right? Things can happen. Um, and then near misses, you had brought those up earlier, but not fully learning from those near misses. When I talk about safety management systems and organizations, I'll bring up just some little example. Like if I'm a solo pilot or I'm out flying by myself and I motion a switch in the aircraft, I'm following my checklist, I motion a switch in the aircraft that was incorrect. I should have done this switch and not this switch. Do I report that in? I reset it, no harm, no foul, nobody else saw it, it didn't damage anything. Do I report that into my safety system? And most people are like, oh no, nothing happened from it. I'm like, well, yes, you should. And here's why. Super simple. Am I the only person that has done that? I don't know until I say something. Maybe every crew at that point in the checklist makes the same error. Maybe the font in the checklist is too small, or maybe I don't realize that I need to go get glasses now. But you don't know until you talk, and it might seem silly or benign, but just talk about these little things. Again, no harm, no foul, right? The issue often isn't lack of data, it's following through with the data that we get into our safety programs as well. So those are most of the patterns I see. Normalization of deviance is probably the biggest one.
Yeah, indeed. No, indeed, indeed. Just as we come into land actually on the conversation, Cody, just one more question would really be around, it's tricky because there is no one magic bullet yeah, and or one intervention which is going to improve global HEMS safety outcomes. But as a recurring theme, I like what you just said there. It's not a lack of data, it's actually utilizing the data and acting on the data,
Mhm.
which is absolutely key. Um, but could I get you to speak to really, yeah, just if there is a uniting theme which you see that could improve global health safety outcomes, is there anything which emerges through because you do interface and interact with so many different clients and so many different HEMS services around the world? Is there anything that's kind of uniting theme amongst those?
Having a no faults abort culture would be really good, right? If I could change one thing globally, it would be making no as respected as go.
Yeah,
It's okay to say no. Um, and it is super important to say no as well. So, making that just as accepted as the word go.
yeah,
Why? Because it directly addresses, pressure in our systems. It addresses cognitive bias that we might have. It addresses risk creep, and it empowers every crew member, to speak up. And saying no is okay. Nothing wrong with that. It's as good
yeah.
as saying go.
It's powerful. It's powerful, actually. Absolutely. And it's permission to speak up, as you were saying. Absolutely
Mhm.
permission to speak up. So just before we finish, a couple of shout outs, actually. So I believe you're just about to start flying for Operation Hilo. Could I get, and then we're going to talk about Hilo Girls as well. The fantastic book that you've written, and we'll put that in show notes. But just speak about Operation Hilo for a second, and then we'll talk about your book.
Yeah, so Operation Hilo is a nonprofit organization that stemmed from the floods we had here in the United States in the Carolina area. And what it is, it's an organization where people volunteer their aircraft or volunteer their time, like myself as a pilot, in the event of a natural disaster where they need to employ assets to help fly in supplies, do search and rescue, things like that. All volunteer, which is really great. So I'm going to start flying with them. I was supposed to this week, but some things happened, so it's going to change until next month. I'm going to go out through their training program. So when an event does occur, hopefully I can, be one of the pilots to help. And it really, a friend of mine flies for this organization, and I remember the last event that they were at. He was flying really long hours, and he talked about being fatigued and tired, and all I could think was, I wish I could get there and help offset, so if, so other people can get sleep and rest and reset, and recalibrate themselves before doing the next thing. And so I'm really excited to start flying with them, and get back to my roots, that search and rescue and that giving back to community piece. So Operation Hilo, it's a really great organization. Again, I mentioned nonprofit, so donations are super important for them and those who want to volunteer their aircraft in time to help.
Fantastic. We'll put that in the show notes actually for people to go in and look at. And just finally, Helo Girls, you've written a fantastic children's book, amongst other things that you've done. Could you just speak to that? We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so man, I love vertical lift. I really do love helicopters so much. My very first time in a helicopter, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And to share that excitement with kids, and we talk about in our industry the lack or the deficit that we're starting to experience with maintainers and with pilots and everyone in our industry. So how do we get how do we bridge that gap? We speak to kids in high schools and we go to colleges and get people interested in what we do. But if we get them at 4 years old or 5 years old, we will have an advocate for our industry for the rest of their life. Now, whether they end up in a pilot seat or turning wrenches on an aircraft or in flight operations or safety, or they don't, or they live near a helipad and they don't complain about the noise because they love it and they understand the purpose behind it. So I started the Hilo Girls series, really with that intent, and then to show my own children and to show them accurately, led with safety. There's a huge safety ethos in the book, doing the pre-flight, the crew communications, the debrief when they come back. I wanted the book to be very accurate and to highlight the many missions that helicopters can do. The first one was firefighting, the second was law enforcement, the third one is air ambulance, and the next one is agricultural. And I have like many, many titles planned after that, but to show the diversity in missions. Here in the United States, this last year, we had major fires out in California. And how great would it be to show a kid via a children's book, that these helicopters, these people in your community are helping serve your community by, helping put out fires around your home and around your schools and, saving your friends and your neighbors in your community. I think it's extremely powerful.
Listen, that's fantastic. We'll put the links in the show notes. I absolutely agree, and I think it's inspiring the next generation to get involved
Yeah.
in air operations, whatever that looks like. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Cody,
Yeah.
listen, thank you for the past hour. It's a pleasure. It's an honor, really, and a privilege to just to walk through your experience and translate that into practice and into the HEMS world. So, listen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Owen. I appreciate it.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.